Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I know this is like a really rough time of night when you have little kids. You're either making dinner or bath time or carpooling, which maybe you're happy to get them. But we're glad you're here and taking time for this really important topic. For those of you I don't know, my name is Phyllis. I'm with Sustainable Wellesley, when a lot of my team members are all here. We are a nonprofit here in Wellesley, and we work with the town on climate action. We work with residents, businesses, and the town to protect our air, water, and land, reduce waste, preserve biodiversity, and advocate for environmental justice. We are very grateful to our partners, the Wellesley Health Department, who, I don't know if anyone's here from the Health Department right now, and also the Climate Action Committee, a town department, for bringing us here tonight. We are gathered in this beautiful new building because it's beautiful and new, but also because it represents a lot of things we might be talking about tonight. This building, as some of you probably know, is a super energy efficient, all electric, high performing school, optimizing both comfort and health. The new Hardy School, which is down the road, is very similar, and both of them are helping us meet the Wellesley's 2050 net zero emissions reduction goal. But enough about that. We're glad to have Lindsey here. Should I call you Lindsey? Or Doctor?
Whatever you like, really only my mom.
Yeah,
can you hear me okay? Yeah.
Okay.
My mom calls me Dr. Burghardt, but most other people, to her friends, most other people call me Lindsey, so that's fine.
Okay, thank you, Lindsey. Well, Dr. Burghardt is here. This I definitely have to read because it's a long, incredible list. Dr. Burghardt received her medical degree at Yale University, completed her fellowship in pediatric emergency medicine at the Boston Children's Hospital. She completed her master's of public health in health policy and management at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. What do you think, Lisa?
I do. Class of 2015?
Yes.
Oh my god.
That we all have to talk about that.
Your secret handshake.
I was health policy, so.
Yeah, same.
Oh, that's crazy. All right, we're taking
She is the Chief Science Officer at the Center for Developing Child at Harvard, the founding director of the Center's Early Childhood Scientific Council on Equity and the Environment. She's a practicing pediatrician, and like many of us, she is a parent. That's a lot. And you make time for all of us. We've invited her here tonight to bring her medical expertise on how a warming climate is affecting the health of our children and to offer things we can do to mitigate that. So some of this topic might feel a little heavy, but we're glad you're here. Making time and coming out tonight is really the first step of making your children's future a little bit brighter and healthier. Our goal tonight is very simple. We want you to leave feeling informed, empowered, and equipped with small, and sometimes large, big, impactful ways to protect your children's health and their future. So I thought for an icebreaker, I wanted to start. What sparked your focus? You have so many things you've done, and children's health can go in any direction, but why the warming climate and children's health? Like, was there one thing that happened, or was it a compilation of things?
Well, thanks for the question, and thanks for having me here. I'm really lucky because I get to do a lot of these fun interactions with people who want to hear about kids and want to hear about climate change. And I have to say, of all the organizers and all the invitations I've gotten lately, your passion and love for this really shines through even on email. So it's just been a delight, and I'm really happy to be here in your beautiful town. And this building is incredible. So well done, whoever made all of this happen. And I think for a lot of us, the path we take, or where we end up, sort of surprising in a way. Like if you told me 15 years ago that I'd be sitting here talking about this, I would say definitely not. I'm going to be intubating children in Boston Children's in the middle of the night, and it's going to be just like ER, the show that influenced me. But I think it was a combination of sort of professional and personal moments that added up for me over time. Being in the emergency room and seeing how much the things that were affecting children are really outside of not only their control, but really outside of the control of their caregivers, and how much the environment that surrounds us really shapes what happens to us over our lifetime, and that can actually be very much for good or the environment can really derail healthy development and change the trajectory of kids' lives. And when I started to think about the root causes of what I was seeing and why that was happening, I just sort of kept zooming out, and I got to the public health school, and even then I said it gets bigger and bigger, and I just noticed that like it was all of these influences that were really shaping the environments, whether it was traffic or violence or air leading to asthma exacerbations. Like I wanted to just help with all of these big systemic issues, and thinking about how to do that led me to the Center on the Developing Child, because they were really, really focused on taking what science tells us and getting that into the hands of people who make decisions that affect the well-being of young children. And so I love that idea of empowering people who are in decision-making positions with information that can really precisely make things better for kids. And so I got this very cool job that I'm like very, very lucky to have, where I think about like what's the leading edge of what science is telling us about what's affecting young children, especially those who are facing significant adversity. And when I looked into the literature and I really thought deeply about what do people need to know about, I was so struck by how things like extreme heat affect children's development well before they're born. And how these things very, very early in life, from the earliest moments of the prenatal period, actually affect most of the outcomes that everybody in this room cares about. So if you care about Alzheimer's or diabetes or obesity or stroke or loneliness or displacement, all of these things come back to the earliest days of childhood. And climate was sort of the unifying thread in a lot of these scientific stories. And then I looked at my own kids, and I have 3 young children. They're not that young now, the oldest is a teenager, but the youngest is 10. And just thinking about the things that I love and the things that bring me joy as a mother, and what I really saw as being really special in their own lives and having that ability. We're so fortunate to be in a position where my kids can enjoy nature and be outside and see the benefits that they get from that. And then taking care of children who don't have that ability and thinking about what it would be like if no children had that ability. It was sort of the intersection of these things that kind of led me to this particular conversation. The center thinks about a lot of issues that affect young children, but you can actually tie all of those issues back to climate, and it's like 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. I know I'm not supposed to talk about this when we're recording because it's not very scientific, but you can literally take any issue that you care about, and within 6 degrees I can tie it back to climate change and children's health. It's a game we can play after the talk is over, but I think it's sort of this intersection of science and personal experience, and I'm excited to talk to you about it more.
That's very funny. So there, obviously, as you said, there's a lot of different environmental impacts on children's physical and mental health. We thought we would break them down a little bit. And earlier when we talked, you said it's easy to put them in like 3 different buckets: air, temperature, and water. So you want to start with air? Like, what are you seeing that air quality issues that are affecting children, and then afterwards we'll talk about ways to help me.
Is it okay if I zoom out first?
Yeah, do whatever you need to do.
Yeah, because I think, and I have my notes of things I don't want to forget to say to Phyllis, so remind me to look at this before we're done, but I can't hold that in this and talk because I'm too Italian. So, I think if we really want to talk about kids tonight, we can start by understanding that climate effects are going to shape all of our lives, right? They're already doing it, and climate affects all of us, whether we're talking about effects of air or water or temperature. But when we want to really understand how climate change is affecting young children, we have to really understand how development is shaped, right? Because development is a really dynamic process, meaning the way that children grow up and the way that their physical and mental health is shaped, it changes from the earliest days of the prenatal period throughout childhood. And when children develop and when they're growing up, their biological system, so their brain, but it's bigger than their brain, it's their immune system, their metabolic system, their respiratory system, they're all developing at an incredibly rapid pace. And this is different than us. So when they're developing very rapidly, they're highly sensitive to the environment. Now, we're all sensitive to environments, right? If it was 100 degrees in here, you wouldn't care at all what I was saying. But children are developing in a way that makes their systems much more sensitive to environments. And so as they develop, they sort of read the environment, and they develop in response to what they read. So for example, if you're a young infant and your respiratory system is still developing and you encounter air pollution, your immune system is activated. There's a cascade that happens that in the short term is highly protective. It's really important to protect your respiratory system from those pollutants. But when that inflammation and that cascade is activated over a long period of time, it's maladaptive. So it creates a response that's not healthy and that doesn't promote development, and it can actually lead to problems like wheezing or asthma later in life. And so the thing about development is that the effect of it on a child of whatever the climate exposure is, whether it's air, water, or temperature, it actually is going to be different depending on the time during development that the exposure happens. So if you're exposed to extreme heat in the prenatal period, you dramatically increase your likelihood of being born too early or potentially even too small. But if you're exposed to extreme heat as an infant, your little body is going to heat up more quickly than an adult's, and so you're more prone to heat stroke or heat stress or to dehydration. And if you're a child learning in school, you're going to have effects on your learning. So this is really exciting actually, because it's not only that developmental science is telling us what to expect when it comes to all these exposures with kids and climate, but it's actually telling us what we need to do to step in at different points of development to protect these different age groups. And so this developmental plasticity, again, is a real opportunity to get kids off to a healthy start, because if we know what the effects are on prenatal development, then we can target at our interventions and solutions, and there's already a lot of communities in many cities that we work with who are implementing these solutions with really good effect, and we're seeing that we can protect kids and that the outcomes are really exciting because development is so responsive to what it's encountering in a bad way when it encounters these climate exposures, but also it's the flip side of a coin, right? There's a good news, bad news about this heightened sensitivity. So you're more likely to see an increase in these negative outcomes, but protecting people during sensitive times of development also leads to an outsized positive effect on all the outcomes that we care about. So that's just my, we hear a lot like kids are not little adults, but it's important to understand why, because it helps us with solutions. And when we think about climate, I do think these sort of organizing buckets of exposures are helpful, but it's also important to understand that they all interact with each other. So when we think about the different ways that kids experience climate exposures, it comes down to the fact that there's forces that are shaping their environment. And when we think about kids' environments, we call them developmental environments at our center, and that really means the full range of exposures that you have in the places where you're living and learning and playing and growing. And we think a lot about physical environments. We think about these beautiful buildings and playgrounds, but the core of all of this is children's social environment, right? So how they interact with their caregivers, how their caregivers are able to show up depending on how they're experiencing climate-related effects. And then outside of that are the built-in natural environments, all of which have the ability to positively or negatively shape development as well. And then beyond that, there's sort of these systemic modifiers. So say if you live in a place with a lot of green space and you have a 100-degree day, you're going to experience that day as a caregiver and as a young child very differently than if you experience that same 100-degree day in an area with a really high prevalence of concrete and a low penetrance of green space exposure. And so it's just sort of important to understand that the way kids experience these exposures depends on this developmental environment that's surrounding them. Now, when it comes to air, I think there's two issues that are related but different. One is air pollution, which is obviously different than climate change itself, in that many sources of air pollution help to drive the increase in temperature that we're all experiencing. And we've known for a really long time that decreasing air pollution exposures on children has the ability to improve their respiratory health, their cardiovascular health, and their mental health. And then there's sort of this intersecting but really different and important category of wildfire smoke exposure, which is, I think, really important to understand as increasing because of climate change for a number of reasons, primarily that forests are drier, they burn more easily, they're less resilient when there are fires, but also because they affect the health of kids over just a really, really wide range of geographic spaces. And I don't know how long you want me to, I can go on for a while, so you just cut me off. But I think that for many of us here, we feel like wildfires are sort of a distant problem, but we experienced last year the wildfires in Canada, affected the health and the respiratory status of children in Boston and New York, and we'll continue to see that, brush fires and wildfires in Milton earlier this year, and we can maybe break it down a little bit more, but I think that while these two issues are important to think about on their own, they also intersect with the things that we're going to talk about later, like heat and water. So the effects of these exposures are going to be different if it's a very hot day, or if there's a drought, or if there's kind of a cascading effect of these two things on each other. So I don't know how much you want to go into the You tell me.
Okay,
I'll take a
maybe-
pause.
Take a breath, some water. Actually, I don't,
Do you want to talk more about air? We can talk.
yeah, so, like, I have my child, what is interesting that you talked about, development, and one of my children has asthma, and the other one doesn't, and one was created and lived a little bit in Germany, and then one didn't, so I went, that was just sort of interesting, but,
No,
air quality, as the climate, as it gets warmer, are allergies getting more significant, or does more people have asthma, and there's more respiratory diseases? I'm not sure.
Yeah, air pollution is a really what we call heterogeneous term, meaning there's a lot of different things that mean air pollution. And the Clean Air Act of 1970 and a lot of what we learned about outdoor air pollution has informed what we know about how air quality affects kids, but it's actually really, really important when we're talking about air pollution to understand that a lot of our exposure to these pollutants actually happens indoors. So over your lifetime, and this is probably higher for young infants and children, we spend 90% of our time indoors. So if you take your age, multiply it by 0.9, that's the amount of time you spend inside. And so for kids, it's primarily at schools and at childcare centers and at home, so kitchens and bedrooms. So it's really interesting in that a lot of what's outside, because of the way that buildings can be kind of leaky, we call them, meaning things can come in through windows or doors or vents, a lot of what's outside actually comes in. And so what we at our center have not done these studies, but other researchers have found that levels of a lot of these outdoor air pollutants are actually higher inside. So I think that when we think about air pollution, we think a lot about what can we do to improve the quality of children's outdoor air environment. And we can take what we know about outdoor air pollution and the effects on health and hopefully use it to inform what we think about inside. But I think the sources of pollution can be different whether you're outside or in. And so when we're inside, actually, what makes up our indoor environment has changed a lot over the last 50 years. So there's a lot more synthetic flooring and different gases that are sort of off gas, they're called VOCs, from different cleaning products and things that we use. And so it can be really helpful to think about where children are spending time and what the sources of their pollution are. Now, the interesting thing, you talked about your son what was the cute phrase you said he was grown in Germany, or what he was?
I was made
in Germany? That's adorable. No, I love it. It's really important to think about prenatal development when you think about some of these air pollution exposures, because we all have a lining around our brain. It's called the blood-brain barrier. And it's actually not fully kind of tightly formed until well into infancy. And it's particularly leaky in the prenatal period. And what that means is that air pollution particles, many have been identified to kind of cross not only the placenta, but that blood-brain barrier, and things like black carbon, which is a form of particulate matter that's very, very tiny, has actually been found in fetal brain tissue. Now we're still trying to understand what the implications of that are, the people who are studying that, in terms of what are the outcomes that leads to. But what it's really important to understand is that these particles, beginning very early in development, have the ability to enter these spaces and to kind of cross over into fetal circulation because they're so small. And that's very different than how black carbon is going to affect you or I. And so thinking about air pollution is a big bucket term that's made up of a lot of different things. This particulate matter, when we talk about particulate matter, it's sort of named according to how big the particle diameter size is. And so if you hear PM10, that's particulate matter with a diameter of 10 microns, and 2.5, or ultrafine particulate matter, is the smallest type. And this is emitted from a variety of sources. Tailpipe emissions, just think things that you probably don't want to breathe in. And that's the type of air pollution that we think is particularly harmful in young children, and that has this growing body of evidence about how it can disrupt our immune system, how it can even alter gene expression or disrupt healthy brain development early in life. This ability that it has, when it goes in children's noses, to pass into their lungs and then through the smallest particles of the areas of the airway called the alveoli into the bloodstream and then into fetal circulation.
That was an ad for electric buses, by the way.
Yeah. Oh, well, so if we want to think about electric buses, there's a really exciting study that came out of Kari Nadeau's lab at the Harvard School of Public Health, and it's really exciting because it takes sort of the kind of cost quantification equation and looks at the economic benefit of replacing one diesel bus, average age in a 2017 fleet, And the health benefits or the cost benefits are really exciting. You know, it's something like 40, don't quote me on the exact numbers, but like over $40,000 in climate-related savings and over $40,000 in health-related savings. But the exciting part is also that kids who spend time on that bus, even if it's only like 20 minutes on the way to school, in that 1 month period had a really substantial decrease in their asthma exacerbations. So over a short period of time. And really excitingly, the bus drivers also saw a health benefit. Now the benefits are going to be different depending on how dense the area is that your bus is spending time in, so it's going to be different in a rural area versus in a city area. But this is a really exciting place, I think, where we're sometimes turned off by the initial cost, and that's obviously a barrier and something that we have to overcome. But I think that in terms of health benefits, it's a really exciting study that shows that this is a real place that we can step in and make things better for kids.
You guys take notes.
Yeah, and please feel free to interrupt me if anybody's already putting electric buses in Wellesley and this is old news
No,
to
I
you.
wish, that's
Yeah.
our next big hurdle. So the next bucket you
Wait,
mentioned.
can we talk about wildfires just briefly?
Oh,
'Cause
yes, please.
water's not as exciting. I mean, we can
Okay,
talk
yeah,
about
yeah,
water,
yeah,
but I think we
yeah,
really need
I
to
mean,
talk about
sure.
wildfires. And I don't know what kind of time you have, so you cut
I'm
me
not
off.
checking the time, but we're okay.
So I think wildfires we need to talk about in this room because we think they're a California problem and they're not. They are a California problem, and I think that there's something that we really need to think about. This is a place where the intersection of understanding how we can improve children's indoor air quality and how we can be prepared for wildfire events, because they will come and affect our kids, is really exciting, and it intersects. One thing that's really, I think, fascinating to learn about is that there's these low-cost indoor air quality sensors that the Boston Public School System has implemented. They have a very cool dashboard and website if you want to go learn about them. They monitor temperature, and then they monitor different particles that are emitted in the indoor air environment and also from wildfires. Wildfires are really challenging to understand and to learn about because it really depends on what's burning in terms of what the kids and what we are all exposed to. So a wildfire that burns in a forested area is going to burn biomass, and that's very different than wildfires we might experience closer to the areas where we all live. Because if wildfires burn around here, and they really realistically could, they could burn things like our homes, which contain sofas and upholstery and paints, and so then those volatile organic compounds and those solvents and everything that's in your favorite upholstery is then aerosolized and breathed in. And what we know about wildfire smoke is that it's probably significantly more toxic than cigarette smoke, and it has particularly harmful effects on prenatal development. So if you have anybody in your life you care about who's pregnant, or anyone who's a young child developing rapidly in those first few years of life, it's really important to understand when wildfire events are happening, what to do to immediately protect people. Because we're understanding that even a single exposure to this type of smoke can substantially increase the rate of preterm birth, and it has a really significant effect on not only children developing new cases of asthma, but having flare-ups of their asthma and having significant impacts of their learning. So children who attend school on days when they're exposed to wildfire smoke have real impacts on their ability to learn. But this is, again, a place where really high-quality monitoring, notification system, air filtration devices really have the ability, if we're prepared, we can step in and protect kids, but this is a time that it's important to be prepared before these things happen and not in response to them after the fact.
And how, we all smelled and felt and saw the effect of the wildfires in Canada. I mean, that's not in our backyard, but that also is a significant effect.
Yeah, but that actually, and it did affect air quality near us. And so I actually checked, many of you may be familiar with the Air Now app, where you can monitor air quality in your town. Do you know this app? So it's, airnow.gov, and I checked, and the air quality in Wellesley on Friday is in the yellow zone, so sensitive groups should be aware of this and kind of be aware when you go outside of taking reasonable precautions. There's not a clear number, that you need to advertise or be aware of, but when it comes to wildfire smoke, I think we're in the range of an air quality index of around 50 or above for sensitive groups, meaning children with asthma, children you mentioned with allergies that can be made a lot worse, teachers who are pregnant and caring for children in these buildings. We need to be aware so that we can make educated decisions about when it's safe to send children outside, and when it's going to be better to keep them inside and to make sure that we have a clean air room. And we can learn from California and what they've put in place in their schools, because there are things that we can do with making sure that our air filtration systems are up to speed and filtering appropriately, and that children have access to N95 masks when they do need to go outside, although they're not specifically made for their young faces, depending on the age of the kid. It's a good thing to do depending on the air quality index and how long they're going to be outside. We can take some of these measures and learn from them, but understanding what the air quality is around you is the first step, and making sure that people who are in sensitive groups, meaning very young children, infants, we're talking a lot about schools, but we need to make sure people who are taking care of babies in town have this information, because child care centers and in-home care centers are often left out of these conversations because they're more fragmented. There's not sort of a unifying system like there is the school system, and making sure that they know, to check for the air quality, and so that they can make an educated decision about inside or outside. And inside classrooms, there's actually relatively affordable, portable HEPA air filters that we need to make sure are up to speed when wildfire events happen, and then that the filters are changed regularly afterwards, because this is something that we can do immediately now to protect kids. There's an incredible resource called the Healthy Buildings website at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health. It's run by an incredible researcher named Joe Allen, and if you have any interest in this, you can go to his website, and it's very consumer friendly in terms of learning about products that are safe to use, to switch to inside, ways to make your indoor air quality better, the types of sensors you can use that are low cost, what kind of information they provide, and what to do in sort of these wildfire events where we may not be prepared, but we want to be. It's like a wealth of information, and he's an incredible source of knowledge about all this, and it's all kind of open access. He also wrote this amazing book called Healthy Buildings, if you want to do a deep dive. My kids are tired of listening to it in the car, but it's it's terrific, and it has a lot of great info.
Well, that's actually good timing as we are thinking about putting possible air conditioning in some of the schools and in the healthy buildings.
Yeah, and cooling in schools is a really important thing to think about, because people don't think about learning and temperature. We're still understanding exactly what the optimal temperature is for learning, but it's cooler than what most of our schools are. There's a really interesting study that showed if you lower classroom temperatures from 86 degrees Fahrenheit air temperature to 68 degrees Fahrenheit air temperature, you can improve student performance on tests and psychological tasks by 20%. So imagine if you had another educational intervention that could improve student performance by 20%. We would all do it and we would pay for it tomorrow, right? Now the thing about air conditioning is that it is great to cool, but we don't want to contribute to the problem. And many air conditioners, worsen greenhouse gas emissions. There are newer generations coming that are solar powered, that they're developing coolants that don't contribute to greenhouse gas emissions, and so I hope that those are going to be widely accessible soon. But heat pumps are sort of my electric school buses of heat, where if we really look at cost savings, if they're feasible, I think it's a really great thing to think about. Cooling has enormous benefits in schools. And again, please don't forget the babies, because little babies in early care and education centers, babies who are in early intervention, who are in in-home settings need to be cool as well. And heat, should we talk about heat? Are we on to heat? Okay.
Temperature.
Like an electric powered steam train coming for you. So heat has really powerful effects on young children, and again, it begins in the earliest days of the prenatal period. So heat has really important effects on prenatal development, both in terms of increasing the risk of certain types of birth defects, but also on rates of prematurity. So following heat waves, there's increasing rates of babies who are born too early. When we talk about preterm births, we're really talking about births before 37 weeks gestation. People hear preterm birth and we sort of, a lot of time, glaze right over it. It's so important to understand how big of an issue this is, because if we have, right now, it depends on what part of the country you're looking at and rates to be precise, but somewhere between 10 and 13% of babies are born preterm in our country. And so if you take heat waves and increase that number even just a little bit, it has huge implications for public health, not only because preterm babies are more likely to die in the newborn period, or to be readmitted to the hospital, or to have difficulties with feeding or with jaundice, but they're also at risk for a range of adverse health conditions later in life. So whether it's difficulties with learning, if you care about how many kids are on IEPs, rates of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, all of the outcomes we care about in adulthood that I spoke about earlier, almost all of them we can tie back to preterm births. And so this is a place where if we care about these things way over here later in life, Like, why not take care of people over here where we have the greatest opportunity to protect them? Now, also think about if you have a baby who's born at, say, 28 weeks, the effect that that has on your family as a caregiver, right? And how difficult it is to have a baby in a newborn intensive care unit or to grow up needing those additional resources. And this isn't to say that there aren't many of us sitting in this room who are former preterm babies who are thriving. It's not that every baby who's born premature is going to have these outcomes, but if we can cool the places where people are during pregnancy and where people are taking care of children when they're pregnant, so thinking about people who are caring for children in the settings that we're talking about who are also pregnant themselves, it's just a huge opportunity that I think is vastly overlooked in public and policy circles. Also, my big one with heat is sleep. And I know that we're thinking about schools and our, broader environment, but sleep is like the glue that holds us all together. And we all know a lot about how light affects sleep. So we think about dark room and get off your phone and all these things that help. But actually, there's a really important core temperature drop that happens in all of us to facilitate our sleep onset. And so if it's too hot where you sleep and that drop can't happen, it's actually harder for you to fall asleep. This is especially true for babies, and there were researchers that learned this during a heat wave in the UK where babies took longer to fall asleep and then they woke up more often overnight. And if babies are waking up more often overnight, guess who else is waking up more often overnight? And then this has really important cascading effects on mental and physical health, not only the next day, but over the lifetime, because if sleep is chronically disrupted or it's not regular, it's really, really important for young kids. So sleep's important for all of us, but young kids, like napping, so thinking about the kids in the early care and education centers, and then overnight sleep is so important for social emotional development, for learning, and for health. So if you learn in the morning that when somebody throws a tantrum, that somebody will come and comfort you, you actually as a young child process and download that emotional memory during sleep. So kids are still learning, like, oh, that's a dog. Then they learn, oh, I have a dog at home, but oh, wait, there's also dogs out in the world. And oh, dogs are furry, and oh, dogs bark. All of these things are memories for them that they process and they learn during sleep. And so if you disrupt a child's nap, or you disrupt their overnight sleep, you actually significantly impair their learning and their retention for things that they learned earlier in the day. And so this is really important because if they're not sleeping well at home and then they're showing up at school the next day, they're learning much less than they would have if they had a good night's sleep the night before. And then there's really important effects of heat on mental and behavioral health beyond the effects of sleep. So heat actually sort of messes with the neurotransmitters that stabilize our moods. So I can tell you all the science behind that, but you can also picture yourself being in like a 80, 90 degree kitchen trying to cook with a toddler pulling on your leg, or reading a book to a toddler like sweaty on your lap when it's 100 degrees outside, or think about having that same experience if you're like under a tree with a cool breeze blowing. We need to think about these contexts for kids in different spaces because it really affects their behavior and their ability to self-regulate. And that's actually really important from a neurodevelopmental standpoint too, because early in life, all of these circuits that are laid down in terms of our mental health and our ability to regulate our emotions and our ability to perform executive functioning tasks, they sort of form the foundation for all the higher order circuits that come later. And so if you don't have a healthy foundation because it's been too hot where you're playing when you're little, it's actually going to affect, so like if there's anybody here who cares about middle schoolers' behavior, like that foundation is set like way over here when those toddlers are playing. And we have the ability to shape healthy development in our middle schoolers with their behavioral regulation by protecting them when they're babies.
Okay, so I need to rewind. I don't see any I'm not sure if there's people with young children. Is this on?
It's fine.
Okay, there we go. And when you talk about temperature, are you seeing more, is the spread of some of the infectious diseases like the vector-borne, the Lyme disease, West Nile, Tripoli, as the climate gets warmer, is that the issue? Is that why we're seeing more of those issues?
Yeah, it's sort of everything, there's a lot of different reasons why, and this is another one of those. So as the planet warms, the places where where the insects survive, where they can carry these viruses, that geographic distribution is spreading, right? So places further and further north that didn't used to be warm enough are now warm enough. It also, I think I blew by your question about allergies earlier, and that's an important one when it comes to warming too, and insects and everything, because warmer climates, actually the plants, when they grow in those warmer climates, produce more pollen. And then this, again, feeds on certain helpful insects and certain unhelpful insects. It also intersects with our conversation about air pollution, because the air pollution molecules sort of glob onto, it's okay, she told me she had to leave, and it's for a good reason, so good luck with the auction. The air pollution molecules sort of glob on to the extra pollen, and then guess what we inhale along with our pollen. And so the sort of issues all intersect, but there's not, a one-size-fits-all approach, and people say, well, just get rid of the bugs. But that's not good. We need to think about kind of the secondary effects of all of these decisions, because ending, youth sports is not also the answer, yes.
So, I am not originally from this area, but I went to New Hampshire a couple of weeks ago, and I was stunned at the number of ticks that I saw. And in thinking about this, I know lots of people use permethrin to keep them away, but that has environmental impacts. And so I am wondering, what are some of the solutions that you have found for kids and adults to be able to be in the outdoors in places that are plagued by ticks, if you don't want to make things worse for other critters, but you also don't want to bring home a bigger problem?
Yeah, it's a great question. If we solve this existential dilemma, this group will, really make our mark. But I think in my own children, I try to do as much as I can with covering them with clothing that's reasonably, provides coverage but still allows airflow, and just really, really careful tick checks. Because not only does, some of these insecticides have really important health effects, think about if we're applying them locally, but also when we apply them in widespread ways, they can have unintended negative health effects on the people that we're trying to protect. So there's many communities that, around that spray widely, whether it's playgrounds or parks, and those chemicals in themselves can have negative health effects on children. And then they get into our water supply, where we're only able to remove so much of them. And so I do think that it's a really important consideration. I can't say that I have it down to a science. I have children crying every week at my house because I'm pulling ticks off of them, but I think there is a little bit of extra diligence for those of us who live in these tick endemic areas to sort of do the best we can to monitor and remove and watch for signs of Lyme. And I know that's not a perfect answer, but I think it's sort of kind of the best we can do right now. Unless you have other things.
You also
to
mentioned
suggest.
to me, I think, promoting biodiversity in gardens would also help support.
Well, that would help everything.
Okay.
So, no, I don't say it to be facetious.
Natural pest control is.
Yeah, I think natural pest control is a real thing, and then I think you're going to get into the woods of New Hampshire or Vermont or Maine, where there were always ticks, but maybe never this many, and that's probably not going to be.
Or this early, too.
Yeah, or this early or that late. I used to have in my clinic a Lyme season where I'd have a heightened alert, and now I look all the time. You can see me in January, and I'll worry about it. I think when it does come to biodiversity, if we could just have one solution that has co-benefits across every domain of child development, it would be greening the spaces where children spend time. And this actually has profound benefits for them, not only for them, but for their caregivers in ways that I cannot overestimate or overemphasize to you. And so I think it's incredible that we have these beautiful playgrounds. It's really interesting that even in places with a lot of resources, I see very few playgrounds that are green, meaning that they contain natural elements, that they contain trees, that they have shade from green space. There's some really interesting studies that show that even children who have a view of green space from their classroom windows perform better on academic tests.
This building was made with that in mind.
Yeah, did you guys do that study? Well done.
I didn't do it.
No, it's true. And then children who have regular access and exposure to green space over the course of time have lower risk of a range of mental health disorders. And there's really positive effects of green space on immune system development and on social cohesion, which we really can't sort of overstate the importance of. And so I think, and there's benefits for drinking water, there's benefits for the temperature. So I think I often get asked to sort of categorize or put a hierarchy to the things I would recommend, and I think that's really hard to do, but I think even if we live in places where there's already a lot of green space, thinking about how are we designing the places where kids are spending time and where we're spending time with them, and how can we increase those elements, green and blue, because blue space exposure, so children's exposure to water elements, we worry about them getting wet, but really can be powerful too.
I was just gonna mention there are a couple of new playgrounds going in, but they're not putting a natural surface on the ground. And part of it is to accommodate, what's it called?
Accessibility.
Yeah,
Mhm.
exactly. And it's really difficult.
Mhm.
And then a lot of the grass is not real grass anymore, so you're looking at green, but how, I just feel like that's such a
Yeah, and
unfortunate thing.
there are some cool programs out there that look at how to, we can connect and bridge and adapt these needs, because of course we want playgrounds to be accessible. There's, I think ways to bring in container elements or more contained, water containing structures that actually it's great if kids who have mobility impairments can also access these elements, right? So how can we make them for everyone? I think also shade on playgrounds is really one that we can consider that crosses the accessibility barriers, where thinking about the way that we're shading playgrounds and if we're doing it from the start is really important. Children can get very significant burns from playground structures after only a few minutes, and so I think it's interesting when I was looking and reading about the history of playgrounds, there was a period where we were removing trees from playgrounds because we were very worried that children were going to run into them. And now
They get a lot of the
Yeah.
slides and whatnot.
Exactly, yeah, and now we're sort of stuck with a different set of issues. But by putting shade near the buildings where children spend time, if they're also near the playgrounds, we can decrease temperature and cost of the buildings themselves, and so it's sort of a win-win.
I'm gonna interrupt you because I
Yeah.
don't wanna go too late. So something we talked about and you actually asked a great question. I wanted you to 5 tips you could prescribe for us, and sort of we had them in different categories. So for air quality, what are the things that you recommend? And I
do
can
I
also
get 5, because I tried to answer this question, do I get 5 per category or do I only get 5?
You can do whatever you want. We're flexible. I have 5. We talked about air quality. We talked about vector-borne diseases, which you already mentioned a little bit. Climate anxiety, and maybe some food choices. Those are the 5 things we thought you could recommend, but I'm not recommending. Those are the issues, but what are things under that? I know some of them myself. But
Yeah, no, I mean, we should give you some airspace because you're an expert too.
No, you should just go on. I mean, we're talking about air quality. We talked. I think a big issue in town. People are outraged about the lawnmowers, the gas-powered lawnmowers, not only for the people using machinery, but for kids playing. I think there's some residual stuff. You can correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, there's actually really interesting health effects if you look at the scientific literature around noise. So it's not about climate, but noise exposure is actually really important, especially people who experience noise on a chronic basis and young children who are sleeping. I think that's an important secondary effect. And then, thinking about how can we decrease greenhouse gas emissions, it's just really important if you look at the drivers of that and what you're getting, in return. Also the biodiversity loss, I think it's an important thing to think about for sure. You talked a little bit about food, and I think that this is a really interesting one because there's so much that goes into our food choices, and food is it crosses so many dimensions of our lives, and there's such a deep cultural component to it. But I think one tension that I come up says the Italian, yeah. Literally, I had 8 ants with their hands all over my faces last weekend, feeding me. But I think, and so I say that because I don't think that we should discount the importance of those things. But one question that I get all the time is that people are worried that their children are not eating enough meat. Every day someone says this to me, that they don't eat enough meat, they don't get enough protein. And we're fed sort of this idea that this is a really important thing. And for many of us, for cultural reasons or for all the good reasons out there, it is important. But from a climate perspective and a health perspective, I think we can reassure ourselves that there is increasing and already robust evidence that eating less meat and more plants is good for the planet and good for our health. If you're interested in learning more about that, I get a lot of information from the Harvard Nutrition Source. It's a newsletter that comes to my inbox. It's very digestible. It's not scientific-y or jargony. I don't write it. But it is really interesting in terms of thinking about our risk of cardiovascular disease and diabetes and what we can do that's good for the planet too. And then there's a company, I don't know if they come to Wellesley, but there's many out there, Black Earth Compost, either doing backyard composting or thinking about ways to decrease your food waste, I think is a really important thing that we can think about. And these solutions aren't unique to kids, but bringing kids into the conversation and talking to them about why we're doing these things in an empowering way, I think can be just another, way to carry this on.
One other thing, let's get this going. How about, we had an induction stove event a couple of years ago, and we had another infectious disease doctor there, and she was talking about how, like, the fumes from the gas stoves were, the kids, obviously the parent or the adult cooking, but is there anything, is that?
Yeah, it's a really important exposure in our indoor air quality. So breathing the off gases from the natural gas that's burning from your stove. It's not reasonable for many people financially to replace with induction cookware. If it is, that's fantastic. And if all things are equal, absolutely, we should go for it. If not, a hood, but not only a hood, but one that exhausts to the outside. And so thinking about ventilation is really important if you're cooking with gas. So in my kitchen, I have a gas stove. That is what it is. I open the window in my kitchen, and if it's cold in the kitchen for a few minutes, and I put on the exhaust hood. And I do think that that's really something that we can do that's easy to improve the indoor air quality environment.
Okay, I think we're close to time.
Yeah, we're
We've
close to
been,
time.
Okay.
it's 45 minutes since we started.
Since we
and
started
it's about
talking.
8 o'clock.
Okay, all right, so I have one more thing, and then maybe we'll do a short and quick Q&A. The one thing we haven't talked about is climate anxiety, which I know many adults and children are feeling. And I don't know if you're seeing, this is a child-focused event, so what you're seeing, reading, researching, any advice you have, any?
Yeah, my answer to this question has changed since last July. I had this very cool opportunity to go to Harvard Sea Change, the Center for Climate Health and the Global Environment, hosts a youth summit every year where they bring in youth who are climate activists themselves, so they're interested in working on issues related to climate. And I said to them, like, what do you think I should say in answer to this question? And they're like, tell people to stop asking you that. And this is not a criticism of you, but they were like, we don't want you to worry about our anxiety. We want you to go and fix this, and then look at these 97,000 things that we're doing and maybe support those. And so I think that it was actually like sort of a stop me in my tracks moment, because it's like, oh, how do I make you feel better about all this? What can I say to you? Like, how can I include you in my efforts? And they're like, we're doing some really cool things. If you guys could like talk about that when you go give talks, or if you could, share them on your platforms, or if you could, draw attention to them or donate money, all these things. The youth are doing some really incredible things out there. Not that they aren't worried, but I think if we're talking about specific messaging, then it comes back to age-appropriate, reassuring guidance and including them in solutions. And I think many of us who are parents know that instinctively. But I think it's also like turning the lens a little bit outwards to look at what young people are doing, because they're super innovative. When I did start learning about their projects, like, you learn a lot, and I think we can kind of take lessons from them in a way.
I think we had a climate anxiety event a couple of years ago, and the professor that spoke, she was a psychology professor, said that with anything you're anxious about, when you take steps, what like these students are doing, it makes you feel better about something. So she really encouraged people to take steps on climate, and it will relieve some of that. And on that note, I just want to point out that the town's website, the Wellesley Climate Action website, has tons of resources of things you can do, as does the Sustainable Wellesley site. It's literally called the things you can do. And there are like big things like put solar on your roof or get an electric car. And there are small things like eat more plant-based food, make sure you go. There's tons of things. And actually downstairs we have a sheet with some of those things, so I encourage you to take that. But
Can I put my plug in here?
yes, please plug.
Yeah, so the Center on the Developing Child has a scientific council that I mentioned. It's an interdisciplinary council, meaning that we have scientists from a range of different expertise, social anthropologists, we have people with pediatric expertise, environmental health, people who are climate scientists, and we come together twice a year and sort of look at what the peer-reviewed literature, the scientific literature tells us about these topics, and then we generate working papers and in-briefs and solution spotlights of things that, again, at multiple levels, that either people can do as individuals or that we can advocate for in the towns and the communities where we live. So I think that our communications team has put together like a beautifully curated website, and it's all very kind of grab and go, and you can take it into a range of settings where you're trying to influence, the health and well-being of children, and check it out. It's a good resource.
Great, so maybe we'll give like a couple questions. I just wanted to say for folks here, if you have questions afterwards, you can always go to info@sustainablewellesley, find one of us in the t-shirt and ask questions, but I just want to thank Wellesley Media for recording as well. And Thank you to you, Dr.
Yeah,
Burghardt.
thank you for inviting me.
And all your busy parents that came and our sponsors as well. And I'll give a few minutes for Q&A. Susan, go ahead.
Just for those,
Just so
okay, so I'm thinking about kids who are involved in sports or children who are playing quite a bit. For parents, for school officials, for health department, at what point, how do they determine it's too hot or the air quality? How do that's one determine?
Thank you, that
how
was on my
to-
list of things to say to Phyllis that I forgot, so I appreciate the question. And actually, there's a lot of really smart, thoughtful people that have already figured this out, and their protocols exist. So like people in Los Angeles have thought about this from an air quality standpoint and made toolkits for schools. There's a group in Connecticut that's made a really lovely heat protocol. A lot of it is about understanding adaptation and context, meaning, when it comes to heat, the change from baseline is really important. And so kids experience, say it's, 68 today. If it's gonna be 72 for a couple weeks, and then it's 74 for a couple weeks, and then it's 78, and then it's 80, they're gonna experience that 80-degree day very differently than if it's 80 tomorrow and we send them out to play football. So part of this is that it takes a number of weeks for our bodies to adapt to heat and to be able to function at these higher temperatures. And then there's a lot of really thoughtful people who are studying at higher temperatures, how often do we need breaks? What do we need in terms of shade? And then there's an idea called there's something called wet bulb temperature monitoring, which is really important to think about in schools. Because when we talk about temperature, there's a lot of different ways that influence how we experience temperature. It's not only the air temperature, but it's the humidity. And so is there a breeze, is there no breeze, what's the temperature, and what's the surface that you're on? All of these things sort of interact together it's almost like a feels like temperature for heat, but it's the way that your body experiences heat. And so a lot of places, there's already schools that are doing this, and so it's pretty easy to find online if you're interested, or I can help point you in the right direction. Monitors say the wet bulb temperature on a AstroTurf football field is going to be very different than the wet bulb temperature on a grassy playground that has a shade tree. And so it's important to understand the temperature where you are and the context of those athletes. So if they're wearing, football equipment on top of it, they're gonna need a lot more frequent water breaks. There's also really inexpensive misting tents, self-misting fans. These things have been developed, but it's really, the first step is saying that we need to have this heat action plan in place, and then we need to think about it before temperatures get warm, because I think what the space that many of us are in now is reacting to the extreme heat days, but we're seeing increased rates of adverse effects of heat on athletes because we're not prepared for that change. And we see the same thing in schools, right? When schools open in September, it's all of a sudden we're having these heat waves in September and October where we didn't used to have them. They were done in August before we got to school. We're sort of in the responsive mode of having to send kids home early from school because the plans aren't in place. And the same is true of wildfire events. So there's an amazing pediatrician named Lisa Patel in California who's developed a lot of toolkits that are in use in schools for how do you monitor air quality, what do you do when the air quality is a certain degree. After a wildfire, actually, when is it safe to go back to school? And monitoring what changes in the indoor air environment in addition to the outdoor air environment. So these things are out there, but I think a huge first step would be to say we need a plan, and then to think about the resources that you need to put one in place. Because the awareness and the notification actually, I think is a really critical first step. Let you moderate.
This is a question of, do I need the mic?
Go ahead.
Okay. So that
I know, I feel funny.
a question about indoor air quality again, and it's, I think, kind of related to, climate change and the fact that we have, maybe more rainy events and something that I kind of have a hunch about with my daughter's school, that I know she has asthma, has, had different exposures, I'm sure, this is, but she's in a part of the school that's the only part of the school that's air conditioned, but it's also a modular building that was not supposed to last this long, and it's been around for 15 plus years longer. And when the air conditioning turns on in the school, her asthma flares. So I'm wondering about mold
Mold and
as a water moisture mold, in, just like, if you were monitoring using one of the Boston Public School kind of monitors, would they also pick up on other factors like that might be playing a role? So,
I don't know the details of what those specific monitors pick up. My guess is that they would not, based on what I know about them, and I could be wrong, they would not detect things like mold or I think humidity maybe.
right.
But there are a lot of ways to detect mold, and there's, barriers, moisture barriers that can be put in place, and a lot of those, the resources for that, actually, there's a great section on the Healthy Buildings website to learn about it. That would be a good resource, but it's, definitely a known aspen trigger.
So there are children and adults that because of medical conditions or medications they're taking are not able to regulate their body temperature as an average person may be able to. And I'm wondering, what solutions have you seen people use other than providing several water bottles with ice or those cooling fabrics that people use when they run, or like those little fans that people can clip in places. What are some other practical solutions that kids and adults can use to lower their body temperature?
Well, I think it's true of all children, not just those that are on medication, but the younger you are, the lower your capacity generally for sweating. So we all have, a couple of ways that we can cool ourselves. We can decrease heat by sweating, right? So you have moisture on your skin, and then there's some type of air that helps to evaporate it. So increasing evaporation would be one way. That's more likely to be effective the older you are, but again, can be decreased depending on if you have a medical condition or a medication or just less ability to sweat. The other way that children actually decrease their body heat is by transferring heat to the skin. And so you have to where it can kind of evaporate into the environment. So for that to happen, the temperature of the environment has to be lower than your body temperature. And so the strategy there, however you want to achieve it, has to be lowering the ambient air temperature. So if you're a very young child, making the room that you're in cooler than your body temperature is really important. It's also really important when it comes to your brain too, because brains can't sweat, right? They have to dissipate heat by sending heat out into the blood circulatory system where it can then go to the skin and transfer into the environment. So anything you can do to lower the temperature in a room.
Anybody have?
Okay. There's a contradictory thing that happens to us in Metro West, and specifically in Wellesley. On one hand, we have a reduction of mature trees with the construction.
Oh, sorry, a reduction?
We have a reduction in mature trees in this area. And then the other factor is we live in a zone where there are highways moving from west to east.
Can you use the
all over,
microphone?
right?
Microphone.
Yeah, so that means Route 9, Route 30, Route 95, Mass Pike, all those roads have hundreds of thousands of cars back and forth every day. And you know of the study in Tufted to indicate there are certain zones that, like Somerville or Chinatown, East Boston, to get more than their share, and the hospital results show that. But there's some things we can do to deal with. I live about 400, 500 yards from Route 9. That's a busy road. So what you're supposed to do, I guess, is keep the windows closed on that side. You should have an air filtration system in your house. There are a number of air monitors you can also get to see what's going on. But do you have any other suggestions? Because a lot of us live near these places.
Yeah, it's really challenging. It's, I think the air filtration is a big one, and thinking about the type of filter and its maintenance, I think is really important to think about. So filters are rated based on their efficiency, and there's something called a MERV rating, the mean efficiency rating for ventilation. I may have gotten that wrong, but MERV 13 filters or higher are most effective at removing the types of particles that you're talking about from the exhaust. The other things that you mentioned, sounds like you're actually quite an expert yourself, so making sure that windows on the side of the building that are facing the road are closed, and then increasing ventilation on the sides that are away from the building, and then increasing ventilation during times of the day where the traffic may be lower, so opening your windows when you can, and then controlling temperatures inside the house, like if you have the ability to cool, because the effects of heat and air together are sort of worse than either one alone.
Lisa, one more question, and then
I just wanted to ask if because I saw recent research that says that sleeping temperature preferred for adults especially to fall into like deep REM sleep, and to avoid having your body temperature rise, which wakes you up, even as a grown-up. And melatonin the production gets interrupted by heat in sleep. I saw that the recommended temperature in the room is 66 or lower. And for kids, it used to be 68 to 72. And so I think in the winter around here when it's freezing out, 70 is okay, but beyond that, maybe not. So what I've discovered is we've been sleeping a little too hot in my house. So we're down to about 66 now. My kids are like, it's freezing in here. And they're 6 and 4, and my little one's like, Mommy, you have a wool sleep sack, you're fine, you buy a temperature regulator. But is that generally the recommendation, and is it different for an adult versus a child who's, I guess there's probably different stages of development where the temperature range changes, and what are the recommendations?
Yeah, I would love to think that we can control our temperatures to that degree of precision. Like we can't, right? You have one tantrum and your body temperature is already, 10 degrees hotter. So I think that you're very much in the right ballpark. A general rule of thumb that I think about from pediatrics is that kids are generally comfortable wearing, a layer more than we are when they're infants, but they also heat up more quickly than we do. And so you can kind of like, sometimes I find myself like in the literature, like, is it 65 or is it 66? And then I'm like, oh my gosh, my grandmother would be ashamed right now if she knew, right? It's like a reasonably cool temperature for sleep. And I think when it comes to young babies, better a little cool than a little hot when it comes to the risk of sudden infant death. And then if you're, optimizing everything else in your sleep environment, meaning you're on your back, it's single fitted crib sheet, there's nothing else in the crib. The room is dark, like you're really doing everything you can and you're close to that range, 66, 68, I think you're doing really well. I think you can tell your kids that they're fine.
Their sleep environments are very healthy.
Yeah. Yeah, we actually just did, there's a woman whose work, if you're interested in this, her name is Rebecca Spencer, and she's at the University of Massachusetts. She's really interesting research around sleep in early childhood. We just recorded a podcast with her, and that'll be coming out sometime this year on our Brain Architects podcast. So we do a little bit of a deep dive into some of that stuff and things like melatonin. And it was a fun conversation because sleep sort of crosses all of these things, right? Anything you care about comes back to sleep.
Definitely. Well, thank you again.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is a great group.